Welcome to the Dayton Literary Peace Prize 2018. My name is Will Haygood. When I was a young reporter, just starting out at the Boston Globe, my editor summoned me to her office one morning and told me that I was going to have to go the following day to the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and that I was going to have to interview a writer and write a feature story about this writer. I asked my editor, and I said, of course, who is the writer? And my editor said, James Baldwin. And so I'm both very excited and quite nervous, knowing that in about 24 hours, I'm going to be interviewing this iconic literary figure. And the next day, I hop in a car and I ride up, and Mr. Baldwin is staying with a couple who has a very nice redone farmhouse. As I'm going in, both of them are walking out, and they said, Will, we're expecting you. Have a seat. And Jimmy is upstairs. That's what they called him, Jimmy. So I sit on the sofa waiting on James Baldwin. A few minutes later, he comes rushing down the steps. He has a cigarette in his hand, and he says, "Hey, baby, how you doing?" There I am with James Baldwin. And I pull out my notebook, and I start asking him some questions about his life, about Harlem, about Paris, about Richard Wright, about writing his books in the state of America. I knew at the end of this interview that I was going to ask Mr. Baldwin something very personal. And I get to the end of the interview and I said, Mr. Baldwin, may I ask you a question that's personal? And he said, "Oh, sure, baby." And I said, and at this point, I had not written a single book in my life, but I dreamed about books. And I said, Mr. Baldwin, do you think that someday I will be able to write books? And he looked at me, and his eyes, which were wide already, got wider, and he said, "Hey, baby, how in the hell do I know that? How come you asking me a question like that? I mean, who knows?" And I thought I was going to fall apart. I was crushed. I was so hurt. I had wanted him to say something like, "Oh, of course you'll be able to write beautiful books, as many as you want." But he did not say that, and he saw the look on my face. And then James Baldwin leaned a little closer to me, and he said, but I'll tell you what, baby, whichever way you go in life, you gotta go the way your blood beats. I had what I needed. All on my ride back into Boston, I thought about what James Baldwin told me. You got to go the way your blood beats. That is what the writers who are being honored here tonight have done with their work. They have gone the way their blood beats. No matter what certain critics might have told them about the subject matters that they were writing about, they tackled it. And it's a beautiful thing to be here to celebrate them. With that, I would like to bring to the stage the founder of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, our North Star, our light, the one and only Sharon Rabb.
Oh, good evening. You look beautiful, just beautiful. On behalf of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize Foundation Board, Mark Meister, our executive director, the advisory council, and the dozens and dozens and dozens of volunteers who have spent the last year making this evening a reality, welcome. I want to thank you, Will Haygood, you're down there, for being our master of ceremonies tonight, especially when you're in the midst of a grueling book tour for his newest book, Tigerland. We appreciate your dedication to the power of the word to advance peace, and Will has become very much a part of our DLPP family. This award, as you all know, is made up of a community of readers and writers working for peace, and that includes every person on this stage. Without you, the awards would not be possible, and we are grateful for and depend upon your generosity. First, a few words about some of our missing family members, Ben Rollins and Ta-Nehisi Coates. In spite of having updated his travel papers, Ben was denied entrance to the United States on Thursday and again on Friday. He assumes because he had recently been in Somalia, where he works with refugees. This is especially sad this evening when so many of our writers are speaking and writing about immigration and refugees. Ta-Nehisi Coates has the flu, the really bad flu. And he regrets, and he said that he regrets not being here with all of you, but he especially regrets not being here with his fellow winners. And he asked that we express that. He did also say that he will be making an appearance in Dayton, to be announced. I don't know what or when, but we will hope that that will happen. But tonight we will miss them both. Perhaps you read the article in the Dayton Daily News this morning about the international growth of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. As these two maps show, we have spread throughout the world. We have, our writers have come so far from 20 countries of origin. As a matter of fact, and I'm quite happy with this, 25 of our 57 award-winning authors were born outside the United States. The settings for our books now cover 55 countries around the globe, and it is my goal to make that map all blue. Over the last 2 years, our winning books have opened with place, a sense of home, a sense of belonging, a birthplace, an identity. But then the stories pivot. And to the displaced, the evicted, the lost, the discarded, and the denied. Displaced people. My husband inherited a painting by a Hungarian artist, Béla Horváth, that he painted on while he was in a displaced persons camp in Bad Gastein in Austria. Since he had no canvas, he painted a majestic mountainside on the back of a Nazi flag. Perhaps because of my curiosity about the flag, I glossed over the words displaced person. But displaced has become an ugly word for me over the last 2 years, an ugly word that relates to war. Viet Thanh Nguyen told us 2 years ago that all refugee stories are war stories. Displaced people are forced from their homes by war, dragged from their homes by slavery, denied their homes by redlining. But they were always displaced by force. The displaced live out the worst curse of the ancient Greeks, as though they were unburied souls that must roam the earth forever, never finding a sense of peace. Last year, Patricia Engel's The Veins of the Ocean followed Cuban and Colombians to the US as refugees and immigrants, and they feel as incarcerated no matter which side of the bars they are on. The soldiers of David Wood's What Have We Done left home to fight in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they returned with the war inside them. Home is no longer home. War is home. This year, Alyan follows generations of a family driven from Palestine by war. They move endlessly, Kuwait, Beirut, Paris, New York, but in doing so, as one character fears, we lose our culture, we sell our souls. Min Jin Lee's Japanese Koreans are forced by war to move to Japan. One character admits, living every day in the presence of those who refuse to acknowledge your humanity takes great courage. Ta-Nehisi Coates shows that the descendants of slaves inherit the struggle for equality, even the struggle to be seen as human here, where they've lived for generations. Michelle Quo's Patrick lives the legacy of white intolerance that relegated his parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents to live as outcasts in the ghetto that is the Arkansas Delta. John Irving has shown us that when mislabeled by society, a person can feel displaced in his or her own skin. Describing people as displaced assumes that some of us are where we belong, and that assumption can lead to haughty arrogance. 40-some years ago, a black friend and I vacationed together in Florida. We were relaxing with a drink when she was approached by a white man who said, "What are you?" It struck me that he said what, not who. I had never been asked what I was. She replied, "An American." He went through a litany of labels, beginning with Mexican, Cuban, and finally ending with the intentional slur, "Are you an Eskimo?" She looked at him directly and said, "Whatever I am, I want to assure you that my people have been here longer than your people." And he backed off. But what shocked me, I was far more shocked than she was that he felt empowered to challenge her in that way, which says to me, she was used to it. Driving past the home where I grew up, seeing another family live in the space which I was once intimately familiar with has taught me that we are, at best, merely caretakers of the land we call home. Perhaps our grave will be the only land we own, and Yorick's skull, if it had a tongue in it, would tell us even that claim is an illusion. We are a land of immigrants who must be careful not to let that sense of home become perverted into a sense of superiority. The stories told tonight, 4 of them written by the daughters of immigrants from Colombia, Korea, Palestine, and Taiwan, will open our minds and hearts to embrace the great variety of our country. As Michelle Quo says in her reflection, reading together is one way to create a shared world. After the decisions of the winners were made this year, I was emailing with Robin Hemley, one of the fiction judges, and I have his permission to share this reaction to Hala's book with you. Sharon, entre nous, as a Jew with an Orthodox brother who lives in Israel and nieces and nephews who have served in the Israel Defense Force, this book brought me into a world I've long wanted to know. I have Palestinian friends, and while we sometimes talk, I don't know their personal stories. I can't think of a better acknowledgement that peace must be sought by individuals as much as by nations than to read these books. I agree. Thank you.
I had a book that came out in 2015. It was called Showdown. It was about Thurgood Marshall's. It was about his Supreme Court nomination battle. In the same year, Mr. Ta-Nehisi Coates had a book, and that came out. And not that anyone writes books for awards, but it just so happens that he and I were vying for some of the same awards when the nominations were announced. And Mr. Coates flattened me like the Black Panther on every one of those awards. So for some reason, I don't quite miss Ta-Nehisi Coates as much as everybody else here does. I also, that very book about Thurgood Marshall also brought me into close contact with Gilbert King, who also wrote a book about Thurgood Marshall. Gilbert's book won the Pulitzer Prize. My book did not. I love Gilbert, but at a distance. There are many students here in high school and in college. I was 24 years old before I met and shook the hands of an author. And I was in Charleston, West Virginia, working on a newspaper at night, and I met an author, and it meant so much to me that when I got home that night, I called my mother and told her that I had shaken the hands with someone who had written a book. So students who are here, and before you leave, don't be shy about finding one of these authors. Say hello to them. They're happy that you are here. So I would like to introduce Margaret Wrinkled, who will be introducing Min Jin Lee and her novel, Pachinko. Runner-up for the 2018 Fiction Award, Margaret is the 2014 Dayton Literary Peace Prize Fiction runner-up for WASH. Born and raised in Birmingham, Alabama, Margaret is a writer, filmmaker, education, and visual artist. Her award-winning documentary, Broken Ground, about the racial divide in her historically conflicted hometown, was featured on NPR's Morning Edition, and it won the Council on Foundations Film Festival. She lives in New Mexico. Please welcome Margaret Wrinkled.
Thank you, Will. Good evening, everyone. I'm thrilled to be back in Dayton to present this unique prize to such a deserving novel. Thank you, Sharon, for this idea you had about how literature can spread peace throughout the world. I came to Min Jin Lee's novel Pachinko through my book club. Our fearless leader, Will, is Korean American, and his grandparents also fled Korea at the turn of the century. Late this past summer, he emailed us to suggest we squeeze in an extra meeting. He told us his daughter, Melina, had come into his bedroom talking about Pachinko, calling it the best book she had ever read. We took her recommendation seriously because Melina is remarkable. She's one of the oldest of her generation of children born to two fathers. She's just graduated from Yale, where she was a Truman Scholar and the co-president of the North Korean Human Rights Group. She's at Cambridge now as a Gates Scholar. She's passionate about criminal justice reform, working within the worldwide Korean community, and she hopes to work for another Dayton Literary Peace Prize winner, Brian Stevenson, who would be lucky to have her. So when she told us to read this book, we did what she said. Her father, Will, made a big Korean meal of galbi, japchae, and kimchi, and we could not stop talking about this novel. The great sweep of it recalls both Dickens and Tolstoy, while the specificity of Lee's indelible characters grounds this saga into a story we can feel happening to us. We sat and ate and talked for hours. We agreed and disagreed about so many incidents, characters, motivations. We ran late. It was the most satisfying book club meeting we've ever had, so they were thrilled when I told them Pachinko had been selected as the fiction runner-up for the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. Lee's indomitable heroine Sunja starts life in a small Korean fishing village until Japan's annexation sends her family into exile in Japan, where they must live as second-class citizens. Lee traces 4 generations of this one family with enormous care, determined to honor the lives of ordinary people who are so often left out of written history. Pachinko is a game of chance hugely popular in Japan, yet it's looked down upon by most Japanese, as are the Koreans who run the pachinko parlors after being shut out of most other employment. By using the name of the game as her title, Lee continually reminds us that life itself is a game of chance and fate, and that we are all subject to larger forces. By detailing so carefully what happens to this one family when they are forced into exile, Lee gently but relentlessly reminds us that this twist of fate, which has already happened to so many of us, could happen to any of us. It had been months since I read the novel when I sat down to write this, and yet without even looking back at the pages, so many moments of the novel came flooding back. Huni's humble kindness, Sunja first meeting Hunsu on that small rocky beach, and yes, him pressing her gently against those rocks. Her initial longing for him matched by her principled refusal, then her ongoing struggle to navigate the long shadow he casts across her life. Her meeting the young pastor Isak, first caring for him with her mother and then agreeing to marry him to give the child she is carrying a name. I'll stop there because I don't want to ruin the journey of the book for those of you who have not yet taken it. But trust me when I say that this book is one of the rare books that will change you by changing the way you see the world. As Min has said, I find that most racism, xenophobia, and irrational hatred disappear with greater intimacy. By working so hard for so many years to create the whole huge, believable world of this novel, Min gives us the chance to gain this greater intimacy, which then changes the way we move through our own worlds. As Melina said, Min makes the stakes of warfare so individual, as she pays homage to the resilience of quiet and epic lives swept up in the undertow of violence. I'm hearkening back to Faulkner's Nobel speech when I say that Pachinko inspires us by reminding us how to not only endure, but to also prevail.
Oh my, it's different from here. First, I want to thank Margaret. She made me cry. It's not that difficult to make me cry, though. Thank you, Margaret. Good evening, everyone. I just want to take a little bit of Ta-Nehisi Coates' time. I want to thank Sharon. Where are you? Thank you, Sharon. And I want to thank Mark. And I want to thank the Dayton Literary Peace Prize Foundation, which is, as you know, comprised of so many individuals. And I want to thank the first readers and the judges for all of your hard work. I serve as a judge for many awards now, and goodness, it is difficult. I also want to thank the volunteers and the staff of the Schuster Center for all of their visible and invisible work, which makes this evening seamless. Thank you. I am so deeply honored to join the Dayton Literary Peace Prize family. I am in the company of such extraordinary writers that I admire so much, and I want to congratulate all of you for your beautiful books. A little bit about me. In the March of 1976, my parents, two sisters, and I immigrated to the United States, and I was 7 years old. We flew from Seoul to New York City, and I recall that long flight vividly. And when I grew thirsty, I asked my dad, what should I do? And he said, say to the flight attendant, juice, please. So that's my first English phrase that I ever learned, juice, please. And every time I said, juice, please, the kind flight attendant, the first white American woman I had ever met, would hand me a can of orange juice. Now, this was so marvelous to me that I kept saying, juice, please. And she would give me a can of juice every time. So I procured juice for my entire family and my aisle. Now, we landed in JFK, and my uncle's John, my mother's older brother, came to pick us up, and he drove us to his modest rental in Queens, where we would sleep in the living room for the several weeks. Now, in South Korea, bananas were extraordinarily expensive back then, and I didn't eat them in Korea. And knowing this, Uncle John bought us bunches and bunches of bananas, and he put them in this enormous wide metal basin. And he told my sisters and me to eat as many as we like. And when we finished all the bananas in the basin, he would buy us more. Unlimited orange juice and bananas, delicious bananas. I thought America was wondrous and abundant and generous. Now, back in Seoul, my father worked as a marketing executive at a cosmetics company, and my mother was a piano teacher. And when they arrived in New York City, they didn't have much money, so they actually operated a newspaper stand for a year. And my father sold the Daily News and lottery tickets and candy in a coat and tie. And later on, he ran a small wholesale jewelry business, which sold inexpensive costume jewelry to street peddlers. We were middle class in Korea, but we were working class in America for many, many years. So why did he come to America? Why did we move here? To answer that question, I need to tell you a little bit about my parents. In 1950, the Korean War broke out, and my father was 16 years old. And he was born and raised in Wonsan, which is now part of North Korea. And fearful that her son would be conscripted by the Communist Army at the age of 16, my pushy grandmother procured passage in an American refugee warship for her sons, for my father and his older brother. And they went to Busan, and they thought they would be separated for just a few days. And they took them to Busan. And after the border closed, my grandmother never saw her sons again. My mother is a native of Busan, and her father is a Presbyterian minister, and he served as a headmaster for an orphanage. And this orphanage served the Korean boys who had been repatriated from the colonial era Japan, for the children who had lost their parents in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. My father and mother were born as colonial subjects of Japan, and they saw their nation divided in two by foreign powers, and had their families separated and witnessed a devastating war erupt and destroy an entire nation. The Korean Armistice Agreement, signed in July of 1953, as you know, ceased hostilities between the two nations, but to this date, peace settlement has not yet been achieved. So why did my parents decide to immigrate to America? Immigrating was not my mother's idea, but she had asked her brother to sponsor us because my father had insisted. He wanted us to live in America because for him, war was not an abstraction. War was something that had made him lose his mother, his sisters, and his home forever. War was something that could take 5,000 years of civilization and slice it in two. And war was something that could take countrymen and make them into enemies. Wars could separate families forever. They could make children into orphans in a flash of light and smoke. And my father could not risk another war if he could help it. My father wanted peace. Now, peace is the opposite of war. We know that. And in the history of the world, we can point to random eras around the world, such as the Pax Romana, the Han Dynasty, the Edo period, the Tulip era, when nations did not fight. And in such times, whether it is for several hundred years or for a mere dozen, when men do not fight, citizens build paved roads. They write plays. They design beautiful buildings, and they perfect the art of paper making. They create printing presses. They invent cures for illnesses to take us out of our suffering. And we gaze at the beauty of flowers. And when there is no war, we fall in love. We bear children, and we dance at weddings. And we can hold on to our loved ones without fear of loss. We turn our swords into plowshares. And today, according to the UN High Commissioner of Refugees, there are 68.5 million displaced people around the globe, and they are seeking for peace. And you and I know that every advanced economy, including our beautiful advanced economy, is terrified of homeless people. We fear that they will bring strife and pestilence and crime into our borders. At the very least, they will bring their troubles and their sadness and their long lists of needs. How will we meet all their needs? And why should we care about them at all? Who are they to us anyway? Perhaps it is the job of the writer to ask, could they be us? Could they be us? We ask these questions. How could we not? Refugees are not an abstraction. I am the daughter of a refugee. And I am here tonight because America has graciously allowed me to have sufficient peace to read and write books. As a fiction writer, I want you to know that I have an agenda. I am trying to make you Korean. Through characters and plot and point of view and tone and setting, for recognition and reversal and catharsis. I am hoping that you will become Korean, because you see, I know that that is what literature can do. Through literature, I have been made Irish and Russian and French and Jamaican and Haitian and British and Japanese and Palestinian and Turkish and Jewish and Catholic and Muslim and African American and indigenous. And through literature, I have been male and gay and differently abled and ruling class and disenfranchised and transgender and orphaned and imprisoned. And through literature, we cross borders and we become united with the selves that we did not know we could be. And we are reunited with the selves that we have lost. And I believe that this is how we approach peace, with our arms held wide open and our hands bearing juice and bananas, to welcome the children into our lives. And tonight, I want to thank you for your fellowship. And I wish you and your families lasting, enduring peace. Thank you.
Sharon Rabb, it's quoted in today's Dayton Daily News saying that war ultimately leads to peace. It was President Abraham Lincoln who said, "A house divided cannot stand." And isn't it fascinating that one of the writers who Abraham Lincoln read during war was Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass wrote about the need to stop the bloodshed against African American people and to heal the wounds of this country. I am going to be introducing Patricia Engel, but I have sort of an instruction here how to pronounce Hala's name, and there's something here, there's a line here, it says, like the musical note. So I've been walking around town saying, Hala from La La Land. That made me sort of get as close to saying it correctly as I could. Anyway, Patricia Engel, the 2017 Dayton Literary Peace Prize fiction winner for The Veins of the Ocean, is the author of Vida, which was a New York Times Notable Book of the Year and a finalist for the PEN/Hemingway Fiction Award and Young Lions Fiction Award. In the acclaimed novel, It's Not Love, It's Just Paris. That's what I told a former girlfriend once. Her work has appeared in The Atlantic, in the Boston Review, A Public Space, Harvard Review, in Guernica, among other publications and anthologies, and received numerous awards, including a 2014 Fellowship in Literature from the National Endowment for the Arts. Ladies and gentlemen, Patricia Engel.
Hello. It's so wonderful to be back in Dayton. I was here just a year ago. Thank you, Sharon and Mark Meester, for bringing me back, and Mark and all the volunteers, Irving, who's been driving me around. It's so lovely to be among such warm people. People asking about my parents who were here last year. It's so nice. So it's great to be among old friends, some friends that I don't see very often, and here they are, like Bob and Margaret and Gil. And new friends, all the wonderful people I've met this year, and so many dazzling writers, and all of you who believe that literature will bring us closer to peace. I'm especially honored to be back here to introduce to you this year's winner of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize in Fiction, Hala Alian. I first encountered the words of Hala Alian a few years ago through a poem a friend shared with me, accompanied by a video showing stark images of war in Palestine. The poem is titled Gaza, and I listened to it over and over, meditating on lines like, "This I did not know, they made smoke like ocean. This is counting your loss, this is losing count. And this is diaspora, this always through a television screen, this always the wrong questions, this 5 other coastlines, this is gutless. This is don't change the channel, the least I can do is watch. This is diaspora. This is carry your name in Bangkok, this is carry your name in Brooklyn, this is wrecking ball of compass, this is weight. This is, I did not know they made sky so famished." And it goes on. Like her award-winning poetry, Hala Alian's fiction is a reckoning, placing its audience at the fractured center of so much loss. Her extraordinary novel, Salt Houses, is an expansive portrait of both a family and a nation uprooted by war and diaspora. It forces the reader to confront the betrayals of colonialism and how this faraway war we often only consider through pixelated scenes of ash and rubble, headlines and photos of wounded children that tug at our soul for a day or two until our busy lives take our attention elsewhere. The lethal theater of faith and rage, and how what so many see as a mere political talking point or a geographical conundrum has left an entire people displaced and so many dead. Salt Houses is a family quest. We follow the Yaqub clan over 5 generations, from 1963 to 2014, starting in Nablus with the wedding of Alia and a mysterious prophecy withheld by her mother, Salma. Driven out of their beloved homeland by the threat of attack, we are thrust into the perspectives of various family members as exile takes them from Palestine to Kuwait, Jordan, Paris, Beirut, the United States, and Jaffa. Alian shows us the intimate consequences of war through a family with the means to leave while others are forced to stay. Like any family, there are secrets, things left unsaid, unfulfilled desires, disillusions, and the heartache of the unknowable. With lyrical and undeniably poetic language, Alian, who also happens to be a doctor of psychology, gives us an exquisite rendering of intergenerational trauma and the silences around it, as the family grapples with the death of their beloved son, brother, and uncle, Mustafa. Over 50 years, through shifts and folds of different political regimes and more battles, we see the family transformed by distance and estrangement from their point of origin, what they hold on to, and what they are forced to surrender. Alian shows us that displacement is also a transcendence of identity through immigration. More than just a shift of status, it is a reimagining and reconstruction of the idea of home, even if in many ways home will always remain a question to be answered. Alia's daughter, Suad, tells her own children her reasons for wanting to leave Boston, where they live now, to return to Beirut, which she considers a sort of home now. Alia says, "Home as in somewhere familiar, somewhere people look like us, where you guys can learn Arabic and be near your grandparents and never come home asking what raghead means." Later we read, in Beirut, Suad has gone back to being Palestinian. To everyone from the cab drivers to the bank tellers, her accent exposes her. It reminds her of Kuwait. As a girl, this cataloging of origins never struck her as strange. Kuwait was a place of expatriation, and everyone seemed to come from somewhere else. Even if a person's heritage was flimsy, unused for years, you were always where your father was from. Through so much loss, until its devastating final pages, Salt Houses shows us that even if forced to leave our homes never leave us. That memory is both a sanctuary and a haunting, and love is the map that guides us as we each navigate our personal exiles. In a TEDx talk, Hala Alian described her own upbringing, having lived in many countries and across the Middle East, moving with her family every few years until she lay roots of her own in New York, and how, throughout her many moves, she came to see reading certain adored books as a refuge and an act of homecoming. In Salt Houses, she has created a new home for us all. Please join me in welcoming Hala Alian.
Oh my gosh. Thank you. Good evening. Thank you so much for that remarkably generous introduction, Patricia. It is so thrilling to be here right now and to share this evening with so many writers and artists, all these people I've met in the last couple of days, Bob, Gilbert, Susan, Margaret, Will, Patricia, David, as well as supporters of the arts. And in particular, I cannot overstate how excited I am to be sharing this stage with these literary forces of nature that have won this year. I've been a reader longer than I've been a writer, and if I can just be a fan for a second, to Min Michelle, to John Tanahasi, I find your works and your visions to be so inspiring, and it's been really lovely to get to know you over the last couple of days. I wanted to start by thanking Sharon and Mark, all of the board members, as well as everyone involved in making this lovely weekend and this event run so beautifully and smoothly. Thank you so much to the judges for selecting this book, to the city of Dayton for your legacy and peace work in making this possible. Honestly, this entire community has been so welcoming and so kind, and I'm a little bit in love with all of you. It's not love, it's Dayton. And I don't know if that deserved applause, but I'll take it. And I also wanted to just say thank you so much to the readers, both the readers for the prize and just the readers in general, to everyone who has read any of the books being recognized tonight, and anyone who will read any of them. Thank you. I want to say thank you to Johnny, and to my loves, Mariam and Talal, and to my mama and my baba. I think more than any country or city, I come from you. So, I wrote a book about Palestine, and if I could have dreamt up an award to win, it would have been this one. The mission of promoting peace and acknowledging literature as a vehicle for empathy and human understanding resonates so deeply with me, and what it is that has always galvanized me both in my work as a writer and a psychologist. My days are spent both bearing witness to the stories of others and creating them myself. And over the years, I've also witnessed the true transformative power of narrative. We become the stories we tell ourselves. Our societies, our tribes, our countries, they become the stories they tell, the narratives they publish in textbooks and headlines. When I think about marginalized communities, the first thing that comes to mind is erasure, which is, of course, the antithesis of peace. Peace thrives on visibility, on transparency and accountability and other big, buzzy $5 words that really just mean the capacity of a person or a country or an institution to say, I see you, I witness you. If I have wronged you, I will find the language to acknowledge it. If I have more access or privilege than you, I will use my voice to amplify yours. Marginalized communities and narratives have long withstood erasure. Textbooks retell the story of the very soil we are all standing on right now. Streets and towns all over the world are named after oppressors and colonizers who are recast as heroes. Erasure has justified slavery, war, occupation. It determines what stories get told, in what tongue, determines who can take up space, what identities are palatable. I recognize my privilege, the luck and education and upward familial economic mobility that happened alongside the marginalization of being born Palestinian, being born to parents who would seek asylum in this country, of growing up in over a dozen cities, making a home in the diasporic identity. Only in recognizing our privilege as much as our marginalization can we begin to contemplate the fight for peace. When I think of peace, I think of cities. Iraq, Sweden, the village my father came from that's long been razed and erased from history. Beirut, Brooklyn, Dallas, Tripoli, Abu Dhabi, Norman, Oklahoma. These places that have made up my identity like unrelated stars being linked into a coherent constellation. When I set out to write my novel, Salt Houses, a multi-generational story about a Palestinian family, my biggest concern, was how to write the diaspora. The novel begins in the early 60s with the family's matriarch and follows their multiple displacements and identity formation in exile into the present day. Daily, I worked with the currency of memory, of inherited trauma, of intergenerational displacement and the effects that has. You see, certain identities exist not in the presence of something, but in the absence of it. And this ultimately is the conflict of hyphenated identities. What it means to live in emotional and literal borderlands, making something sometimes with nothing. Peace, then, becomes synonymous with resilience, synonymous with wedding parties among ruins and kite flying under siege, with making art and music even in the face of war and occupation and fear, not knowing if your children's going to live to 5th grade, with telling stories. The function of storytelling on a psychological and anthropological level is partly to connect with others, to stretch our imaginations like a muscle, but it's also rehearsal. We rehearse our capacity for love in storytelling, our fears, our adventures, even our deaths. We rehearse worlds without borders, worlds with equality, empathy. We rehearse peace. We write ourselves back into stolen narratives. That's what the writing of this novel felt like. I wrote the majority of this book in this country, that still doesn't formally recognize Palestinian sovereignty, doesn't recognize even the state of Palestine. But I think if marginalized communities have learned anything over the centuries, it's that the powers that be can shuffle around our borders and rewrite our maps and sell our recipes and labor and soil and fashion and even for some bodies, but they can't erase collective memory. The act of remembering finds a way. Life finds a way, survival finds a way, and one of the things I learned after this book came out was that somehow The telling of this story became its own kind of recognition, perhaps the most precious kind. A recognition for which I am unspeakably grateful between readers. Both strangers and family, Arabs and Westerners, everybody in between who reached out to say they felt witnessed in this story, or that it had called upon them to do the witnessing. A recognition that continues today, being awarded a literary peace prize for a novel about Palestine. For peace to exist, there has to be humanization. For peace to exist, there has to be representation. When I think of the most powerful art, photography, literature for me, they're often the ones that use the other to show us something about the self. Sometimes it's something broken or ugly or light-filled, but it reminds me that I belong to something larger, communal. I see it in my patients. I see it in my parents who came to this country with erased identities and bank accounts and raised artists and scientists and dreamers on foreign soil. And I see it in books, that first and last love of mine, in stories about middle-aged women in San Francisco and broken children in 19th century England and islands and outer space and pirates and love that allowed me to practice doing the witnessing. We talk often about gratitude when it comes to witnessing, but there's a power to it as well, a humility, an antidote to oppression. You see, the act of witnessing changes both the witnesser and the witnessed, and storytelling is the crux of that process, which is what makes the very existence of this prize so remarkable, so revolutionary, an attempt at countering erasure, at inviting writers to do the difficult, sacred work of telling the truth. And I feel so deeply honored to be part of this legacy, this beautiful Dayton tribe, honored to be recognized, to be seen, to be witnessed. Thank you.
These acceptance speeches are worthy of prizes. Speaking of all these prizes, it makes me feel a little wistful. But there were two things that happened on my book tour that keeps me going. My alma mater, Miami University, right down the road, I was at a homecoming, Miami, love and honor. And I was at a homecoming football game, and the president and the athletic director called me down on the football field at halftime. I didn't know why. And they told me that I was going to be the recipient of a gift. I am a former athlete at Miami University. I played on the junior varsity basketball team. I set the bench. I broke out of a scoring slump against Ball State and scored 4 points. But being down on the football field, it was pretty heady stuff because the game was on ESPN, and the athletic director unwrapped the gift, and it was the most gorgeous, beautiful red and white varsity letter jacket that you have ever seen. I got a varsity letter jacket. I mean, I am the most celebrated, undistinguished athlete in the history of Miami University. And my second great gift was because of President Spina at the University of Dayton. When I was there giving a talk, he and Tiffany Taylor Smith unwrapped another gift, and this was a piece of wood from one of the fabled basketball courts at the University of Dayton. And it was wrapped very beautifully, and Coach Don Donaher had signed it. And I thank you for that, President. So I say to Ta-Nehisi Coates, I'm leaving Dayton with my head held high. I am going to be introducing Susan Southard. Susan will be introducing the nonfiction runner-up, Michelle Kuo. Susan Southard, the 2016 Dayton Literary Peace Prize nonfiction winner for Nagasaki, holds an MFA in creative writing from Antioch University, Los Angeles, and was a nonfiction fellow at the Norman Mailer Center in Massachusetts. Nagasaki also won the J. Anthony Lucas Book Prize, sponsored by the Nieman Foundation at Harvard University in the Columbia School of Journalism. Nagasaki has been published in England, Denmark, Spain, Taiwan, and China, and next year it will be published in Japan. Southard is the founder and artistic director of Essential Theater in Tempe, Arizona. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome my good friend, Susan Southard.
Min was right, it is different up here. Hi, everybody. It's so wonderful to be back. Thank you to Sharon and Mark for allowing me to be back. And this year I was really privileged to serve as one of the 2 nonfiction judges. And it is an extraordinary honor for me to introduce to you Michelle Kuo and her beautiful book, Reading with Patrick, a teacher, a student, and a life-changing friendship. I went to the Mississippi Delta, Michelle writes in the opening paragraph of her book, with a specific project, to teach American history through Black literature. I imagined teaching literature that had moved me. I envisioned my students galvanized, as I had been in the 8th grade, by Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail, and mesmerized as I had been in high school by Malcolm X's autobiography. Books had taught me to admire a person's will to confront the world, to evaluate his experience honestly, as Ralph Ellison wrote. Books had changed me, charged me with responsibilities. And I believed that books could change the lives of my students. I was unabashedly romantic. I was 22. And there begins the story of a young woman daring to turn away from her family's expectations and go to Helena, Arkansas, one of the most impoverished regions of our country. It is the story of her entering into the 8th grade classroom of a last chance alternative school for students considered unteachable. It is the story of the young students gradually opening up to her and to their own hunger to learn and express themselves in writing. It is the story of the relationship between this teacher, Michelle Kuo, and Patrick Browning, a young man who demonstrated great gifts as a writer, even as he carried within him intense burdens of our country's history. And it is a story of literature itself, and its ability to penetrate suffering and offer connection, meaning, and new possibilities for how we see the world. I, for one, felt like I was in Michelle's classroom with her, and later in the jail where Patrick awaits his murder trial. She humbly exposes her own naivete, misjudgments, and doubts, and brings alive the humanity and vulnerability of her students, most especially Patrick. I don't want to tell you more, with the hope that if you haven't already, you'll read Reading with Patrick very soon. What I can say is that Michelle's honest, nuanced, and intimate storytelling offers us a way to enter the world of Helena, Arkansas, and grapple with some of the profound issues of our time, including the legacy of slavery, class inequality, personal and community identity, and how we in this country educate or don't educate our children. Toward the end of the book, Michelle contemplates how Patrick's life might have gone differently if she had stayed in the Delta. She admits that it's wishful thinking that she might have saved him, as if, she writes, "I think I'm so important in his life." It's not like that, she adds. Or maybe it is, in the sense that the alternative, the rational thought, would be to say to myself, "You can't do that much. You're not that important. There are so many forces in a person's life, good and bad. Who do you think you are?" That's what I said to myself. That's what I said to make myself feel better after I left the Delta, she writes, and sometimes I still say it. But then what is a human for? A person must matter to another. It must mean something for two people to have passed time together, to have put work into each other and into becoming more fully themselves. And isn't that what the Dayton Literary Peace Prize is all about? About stories that matter to who we are as individuals and nations, about expanding our understanding of the way others live on this planet, past and present, about opening our hearts and becoming as accountable as possible for the impact of our actions on others. For all these reasons and more, I ask you to please join me in congratulating and welcoming to the stage this year's Dayton Literary Peace Prize runner-up in nonfiction, Michelle Kuo. Where is she?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Susan. That was such a generous and kind introduction. And thank you, Sharon, and the volunteers, the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, the first readers, the people who have been taking such good care of us. I'm from Kalamazoo, Michigan, and I feel at home. Thank you, Ohio. I cannot resist. I am so happy that Will started by telling us there are high school students here. Could you just stand up if you're in high school right now? Stay standing. Could you stand up if you're in college? Yes. Stay standing, please. Could you stand up if you're a teacher or have taught? To all of you who are students, you can write a book. You shall write a book. You write a little every day and hate yourself for a long time. Somebody asked me recently at a reading, why did it take you so long to write? And I said insecurity and self-doubt, and that pretty much finished it. And for those of you who are teachers, I wrote this book for you to honor your work. It is the hardest job that exists. It's a job, the only job I know, where you have to be on your feet all day, where you work with people every day, where you're a counselor, where you're a therapist, where you're a teacher, where you're a transmitter of information, where you're a friend. So thank you for what you do. I want to start by telling you a little bit about the story that Susan started to tell. I didn't grow up with many Asian Americans. I think that's why I was drawn to African American literature. It was my way of proving that I was American, that I was the best kind of American, a citizen who cared about our history, a citizen who cared about minorities. And I was struck by James Baldwin from a very early age. He said, if we are to change the racial nightmare and change the history of the world, we must insist, like lovers, on the consciousness of the other. That word lovers is so strong. It's a word we reserve for usually one person in our life, not the whole world, certainly not strangers, certainly not people of a different race. When I went to the Mississippi Delta, I was drawn to the history. It was 2004, and I was drawn to the history of the 1960s. This is a place where Stokely Carmichael came up with the term Black Power. This is a place where Martin Luther King, a man who had seen it all by 1964, wept when he saw 4 kids sharing an apple. And I wanted to continue that movement. But this is also a story of incredibly naive optimism. And so I myself was shocked when I found a place that was still poor, still segregated, and still dramatically in need of change. I made a lot of mistakes in the classroom. By the time I figured out how to teach, I was about to leave. The student in this book, Patrick, was 15. He was a peaceful kid. He broke up fights. He loved silent reading. He was curious about the world. Our roof had a leak, and he was the kid who would show up with a bucket and mop while we were all complaining. And Patrick had just one problem, which was attendance. He had trouble coming to school. And because I was crazy and 22, I would just show up at his house and be like, hey, you need to come to school. And he came. He came the next day. His mother was working 2 jobs on minimum wage, and there just wasn't anybody at home to help him come. She was overwhelmed. He made incredible progress in this classroom. He got the most improved student award. He was flourishing. He was writing poetry. And I got into law school. My immigrant parents were thrilled. They were like, why are you in Arkansas being a teacher? And they also noted strongly that I was single and said, nobody wants to marry Mother Teresa. Thank you, Mom. She also noted that all my friends who were staying, which was a true observation, tended to be in couples, because if you live in a rural area, you know that it's difficult to date. It's quite lonely. I left right when Patrick was flourishing. I thought to myself, this is too early. This isn't the time yet to go and better myself. But I left. And I found out 3 years later from a friend that Patrick had gotten into a fight and killed someone. I was shocked. I didn't believe that this was true. And as I look back at this now, I recognize that that kind of shock is a reflection of a middle-class upbringing. That when you get caught up in violence, it often has almost nothing to do with so-called character. It has to do with poverty and with the feeling of needing to defend yourself. And that is exactly what happened in Patrick's situation. His sister, who was younger and was special ed, hadn't come home from school on a school night. It was nearly midnight, and Patrick's mom had asked him to go find his sister. Patrick is the man of the house. He has 3 younger sisters, and he went to find her. He couldn't find her. He felt like he let his mother down. And right when he got back to his house, he saw his sister. She was with an older man in the neighborhood. who was 25 and heavily drunk. The autopsy would have it at .26 later on. He kept telling the guy to get off the porch, get off my porch. The guy wouldn't get off his porch, and Patrick got a knife and stabbed him. This is not an atypical story. It's a story of somebody defending himself who is sure that police will not defend him. It's also a story, I think, that is typical in the sense of how much race is a part of it. He was charged with first-degree murder. On the first day of any criminal law class, you know that this is not first-degree murder. It's not premeditated. And also, one wonders if whether he would have been charged had he not been black, since he was on his property, and the quote-unquote aggressor was an African-American who was heavily inebriated. The book, though, isn't really about this crime. The book is about Patrick and how he was doing. When I went to find him in the county jail of Arkansas, he didn't want to talk about his legal defenses, self-defense, provocation. He wanted to feel guilty. No matter how much I tried to tell him about the sociological origins of crime, about poverty, about how this wouldn't have happened if he had been born in a different zip code, he didn't want to talk about that. And I want us to think about that, but about the kind of guilt a person feels, about what happens in our lives when we carry that guilt with ourselves and do not forgive ourselves. And this book is really about mercy, about ways we find mercy to forgive ourselves. Because Patrick didn't want to talk about the crime, I realized I had nothing to talk about. I thought I had this great idea of having him write a letter to his young daughter, who we felt he had let down. And Patrick's letter to his daughter was something that I didn't recognize. I didn't recognize his handwriting. His skills had regressed since he dropped out of school. And even more than that was the content of the letter. It basically said, "I'm sorry for letting you down. I'm sorry for not being there for you." So I asked myself, how could I convince him that he had something worthwhile to share? Something more than just apology. And that's when I started bringing books to jail. I brought poetry. I brought picture books of trees and birds. I brought Frederick Douglass, James Baldwin, all of this literature to see what he would fall in love with. We memorized so much poetry, and because we're in such a literary audience, just a couple of poems. Haikus, which we learned in kindergarten, get a bad rap, are actually a deceptively simple masterpiece. This one is about the first day of snowfall, deer licking first frost off each other's coats. Another, quite funny, "Don't worry, spiders, I keep house casually." And this one, "Napped half the day, no one punished me." We read Frederick Douglass. When I read Frederick Douglass growing up, I thought of him as a kind of icon, an American hero, an uplifting story of somebody who escaped slavery and became the world's greatest orator and writer and abolitionist. Patrick read the story very differently. It put him in a state of panic. There's a part in Douglass's book that I didn't remember reading growing up, where the masters give slaves gin on Christmas Day as a way to trick them so that they would be stumbling on the fields and believe that they don't deserve freedom. When Patrick read this part, I could tell he wanted to stop reading because it hit him so hard. There's a line in Douglass where he says, it's this everlasting thinking of my condition that torments me. And Patrick said to me, he related to Douglass. And then he said, but I'm not good like him. And I wish he had known then how much he seemed like Douglass to me, how he kept reading in a concrete stairway with no light in the jail, how he finished the book before me, even though it was painful for him to read it. We read Marilyn Robinson. She has this line, it's a fictional dad to his son, that says, if you ever wonder what you've done in this life, and everybody does wonder, you have been a miracle to me, more than a miracle. And something about this language stirred his desire to write to his own daughter, and his notebook became filled with hundreds of letters to her. Imagining them going down the Mississippi River, imagining them reading together, imagining them finding a mountain to climb together. And I thought to myself, and I ask all of you this today too, how many of you have let down somebody and faced them every day, word by word, holding yourself accountable? It takes courage to do that. The story doesn't end here. There's indisputable intellectual transformation for both of us. But when he gets out of prison, he's still struggling. His food stamps get cut off. He's been homeless. He's been hungry. His mother, who was his best friend, passes away. He has child support debt that is staggering. It's impossible to pay off. He doesn't have health care, so that health care bill gets sent to a collection agency. And so usually I just end here and I'm like, well, what can books do? Did books change his life? But because we're here, I just want to add a few ways to answer that question instead of leaving you on that stark note. I do believe books did change a few things. Books charged his inner life with beauty, with imagination. Books gave him images and that gave him joy: deer, frost, mountain, water. Books gave him a language for what he had lost in his life. They gave him a language to speak to his daughter. Books taught him his own courage. I think one reason people don't read is because reading is difficult. Reading is a form of thinking, and he chose to think rather than to not think. How he kept reading Douglass even though it hurt. And last, the story is also about us, how reading gave us a fleeting feeling of equality, where neither one of us had a better interpretation, where each of us brought to the room a private feeling. I still don't know exactly what the story is about, because the ending is still ongoing. He is still struggling, I'm still struggling, and we're not in the same place anymore. And so I just want to say at the very end of this talk that even though I'm up here standing on a slightly elevated thing, I forget what it's called, it's a thing, we are all trying to find meaning in our lives. I know everybody in this room is. And I do believe that we find it when we step outside of our circles, when we dare to make mistakes, as we will when we try to forge connections with other people of different backgrounds. In this case of a person who is apparently violent, he found a little piece of utopia in books and in literature, and so did I. And in those moments in jail, we did share that utopia, even though I got to leave and he had to stay. And I just want to end by saying, when one writer was asked why she wrote, she said, "One must create a world in which one must live." And that is what I found with my students. That is what I found with myself. And that is why I so admire my fellow winners who I've had such a delight to meet, John, Hala, Minjin, Ta-Nehisi, and Spirit. And so I want to thank you all for being such a wonderful audience today, and for being readers, for welcoming us here, for creating a space where we can have our little piece of utopia. Thank you.
I'm going to be introducing David Wood, who will be talking about Ta-Nehisi Coates, the 2018 Dayton Literary Peace Prize nonfiction winner for We Were 8 Years in Power. David Wood, the 2017 Dayton Literary Peace Prize nonfiction winner for What Have We Done, is a veteran war reporter and a staff correspondent for the Huffington Post, where he won the 2012 Pulitzer Prize for national reporting on severely wounded warriors. A birthright Quaker and raised as a pacifist, Wood has spent more than 30 years covering the U.S. military and conflicts around the world, most recently in extended deployments embedded with American troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. Ladies and gentlemen, David Wood.
What a night. This has been absolutely extraordinary. And I am honored and thrilled and frankly a little intimidated to be up here talking to such an august gathering of literary talent and dedicated readers and supporters of literature. So my voice shakes a little bit, it's because I'm a little intimidated. And just an update on my employment. So I was, in fact, a staff writer at the Huffington Post, and I was laid off about a year ago. So, but that's okay. I'm having a good time. So I am a presenter, actually a presenter of someone who's not here. But I take pride in this nonetheless. And as a presenter, I got a new copy of Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, We Were 8 Years in Power, An American Tragedy. And it's a good thing that I got a new book because the book that I had of his was heavily used. So the pages were dog-eared, margins were filled with scrawls and scrawled notes and arrows and exclamation points and question marks and what the does this mean? And there were a couple of pages where there were words circled that I had to go look up. So for me, this book was not simply to be read, but to be worked over, to be argued over, to be questioned, to be reread, and its footnotes to be used as a guide to further enlightenment. So one passage I particularly like, and I underlined this and put parallel lines beside it and a check mark and a star, because it really describes how Ta-Nehisi came to think about the art of writing. And it's so good, and I'm going to read it to you. It's sort of in a passage where he's describing how he drew from hip hop the determination to use words not just for their weight and clarity and music and rhythm, but also, as he says, without sanctimony or homily. I had to look up homily. Okay, so, and this is what he wrote. Art was not an after-school special. Art was not motivational speaking. Art was not sentimental. It had no responsibility to be hopeful or optimistic or make anyone feel better about the world. It must reflect the world in all its brutality and beauty, not in hopes of changing it, but in the mean and selfish desire not to be enrolled in its lie, not to be co-opted by the television dreams, to not ignore the great crimes all around us. Boy, does that sum up this book. The book we're celebrating this evening is hard and difficult and brutal in part. You know, it's a poem, it's a song of hard truths. And it doesn't make us feel better about the world. So yes, it's grappling with the most persistently difficult, ugly strain in American life, the clashing images of ourselves as a democracy in which every one of us is born created equal, and that of the white supremacist state, which continues to just subjugate millions of its citizens as it holds and wields unchanging power. You know, I like to think of this book as sort of an extended inquiry. And at one point he writes, "This is me in motion. This is Ta-Nehisi Coates wrestling with these big issues as he explores and reads and questions and interviews and thinks and rereads and rethinks. And in the best sense, this is a workbook for all of us. And so it's fitting that we're honoring this book here in Dayton because of what happened here not too long ago. So you know that I spent some time in Bosnia during the war, and I can attest to the depths of the bitterness and blindness and burning anger and fear and resentment which exploded into deadly conflict there. And to the power of what happened here, as Richard Holbrooke got the leaders of that convulsed region into a room where they could begin to reach for a common understanding of the way forward. In much the same way, Ta-Nehisi Coates has created a room, a space, that he invites us to enter to work through our fears and our blindnesses and our myths and begin to reach some common understanding of our way forward. So as with Richard Holbrooke gathering these guys together at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, there's no diplomatic niceties here, no red carpet, no glittering crystal and silverware, but just raw, hard, sometimes brutal work of struggling toward a shared understanding of the work ahead. Because there's no doubt about this, that the Dayton Accord, which we celebrate here, was only a beginning of the hard work that had to be done on the ground, the difficult and frustrating and unending work for many people in that part of the Balkans, accepting the painful need to redefine who they are. And 8 years in power offers us that same kind of space to clear away the beliefs and misconceptions to which we cling, and to begin to accept the need to redefine ourselves in relation to one another. Now, I'm pretty disappointed that Ta-Nehisi Coates isn't here tonight. For one thing, he gave a speech at West Point not long ago, and in the middle of the speech, he stopped. The entire Corps of Cadets was there. He stopped and said, "Did y'all read Grant's memoirs?" And there was like dead silence, like embarrassed silence. And he said, yeah, you all ought to read Grant's memoirs. It's a great book. I learned a lot about writing from it. So I have a copy of Grant's memoirs, which I really wanted him to sign. So I'll get him to sign. So I'm sorry that he can't be with us here this evening, but I trust that does not and should not diminish our determination to truly honor this work by recommitting ourselves to address the issues that he raises brutally and beautifully in this year's Dayton Literary Peace Prize for Nonfiction. Thank you.
It is now my duty to introduce two people. I'm going to be introducing Katie Martin, who will share insights about Richard Holbrooke and this award, as well as her personal remarks about John Irving. And I'm also going to introduce Bob Psicosis, who will introduce John Irving in his work. After I finished saying a few things about each of you, Katie and Bob. You can both at the same time come up to the stage like Jay-Z and Beyonce. Best-selling author and human rights advocate Katie Martin is a member of the DLPP Honorary Advisory Board. She has served as chair of the International Women's Health Coalition, chief advocate for the UN's Office of the Special Representative for Children in Armed Conflict, and board member of Human Rights Watch. She is currently a director of the Committee to Protect Journalists and board member of the International Rescue Committee, the New America Foundation, and Central European University. She is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, PEN International, and the Authors Guild. A contributor to major networks and news publications, Martin has also published 9 books, including Enemies of the People, My Family's Journey to America, a 2010 finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Prize, Paris, A Love Story, a New York Times bestseller, and True Believer, Stalin's Last American Spy. Among countless honors for writing in human rights advocacy, Martin has received the Commander's Cross of the Order of Merit of the Republic of Hungary. She was also recognized by the United Nations and named a Rockefeller Foundation Creative Arts Fellow. Bob Psicosis is the 2014 DLPP Fiction Award for The Woman Who Lost Her Soul, and a member of the DLPP Honorary Advisory Board. His first collection of stories, Easy in the Islands, won the National Book Award for First Fiction, and his second collection, The Next New World, was awarded the Prix de Rome from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. He is also the author of the novel Swimming in the Volcano, a finalist for the National Book Award, and The Immaculate Invasion, a work of literary reportage that was a finalist for the New Yorker Book Award for Best Nonfiction of the Year. His most recent novel, The Woman Who Lost Her Soul, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and selected as the Best Book of the Year by the Washington Post, NPR, and others. Bob is a contributing editor at Outside, a former columnist for Gentleman's Quarterly, and has served as a contributing editor for Harper's and GQ. Stylish man. His op-ed articles on the U.S. military, Haiti, and Florida politics have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. Ladies and gentlemen, the very, very eloquent duo of Katie Martin and Bob Psicosis.
Thank you, Will. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Will, your absolutely extraordinary performance this evening has only been slightly marred by the fact that you called me Katie. I'm a proud Hungarian named Kati, but we'll talk about that later. This evening, ladies and gentlemen, could only take place in America. And like David, I am completely overwhelmed and intimidated by the quality of the speakers and by the depth of the humanity. And Min, you have made me feel Korean, and Hala, you have made me feel Palestinian, and you have all made me feel very proud to be an American. And Min, I also thank you for giving me permission to be emotional, because Dayton is a place that's so full of emotion for me. But before I go on to speak about Richard Holbrooke and what he did here in Dayton, and I was privileged to be by his side. We were relatively newlyweds, and so he wanted me right there inside Wright-Patterson with him as he brought these Balkan warlords and war criminals to heel. Before I launch into that, I want to just acknowledge the remarkable thing that, Sharon, you have done here in creating such a community. And there are so many other people that I've become friends with, thanks to you, and thank you for calling me back every year. It's become one of my favorite rituals in my life, and I cannot think of a more meaningful way to honor my husband's legacy than to name a literary peace prize after him, and of course this year to be able to present it to the singular talent that is John Irving is a particular thrill, and it would make Richard very, very proud. I have, as I was listening and deeply moved by all of the speakers, I have made an absolute mess of my remarks because I kept borrowing John's pen and crossing out stuff and writing stuff. So if I can make out what this is, it'll be a miracle, but let me try. It'll be a shorter miracle than the one I originally intended to say because I want to hear John, not me. John, of course, has expanded our vision and stretched it to embrace the quirkiest, most ferociously human and independent souls and made us love them as he does. Richard Holbrooke, too, was a humanist. His brand of diplomacy was one human at a time, and his ultimate target in bringing these warlords to the peace table was the human psyche. He studied them. His diplomacy was not an institutional abstract concept. It was paying very close attention to the man across the table and observing him. And even his many dramatic eruptions have been theatrically portrayed. And I can tell you that those so-called eruptions were carefully rehearsed, because he rehearsed them with me. And when he would hit a wall with Milosevic or Tudjman or Izbegovic, he very often asked me to take them for a walk in that lovely parking lot outside Wright-Patterson, where I circled and circled and circled, and Richard's instruction to me was, make them focus about their future and the future of their children and their grandchildren. And let me tell you something, those guys were not interested in their grandchildren's future. They were interested in one thing: power and holding on to power. It was such an eye-opening experience for me to discover that people who make war should not be the people in charge of the peace. I think Richard and John, who unfortunately didn't know each other, but I think they would have really liked each other. John and I have known each other for a couple of decades, and I think that they both, I hope I'm right in this, John, I think they both feel that our country is built on a particular vision and not merely on power, that their America inspires and draws the dispossessed to our shores for a second chance. I hope it still does. I hope it still does. as I mentioned, Dayton is deep in my heart, and I partly because I shared the most dramatic weeks of my life here in that fall of 1995. But also because I observed Dayton, the town, play its role for history, because the town was very much, and Richard encouraged that, was very much involved in the entire process of making peace. And the reason Richard chose Dayton was because it was in the heartland, because it was middle America. He didn't want it to be in one of those glittering diplomatic settings that are usually chosen, Geneva or Vienna or Paris. He wanted this to be an American peace, with Americans surrounding that base. He wanted those guys behind the barbed wire, but he wanted the town to be involved. And the town was, and through this amazing literary Peace Prize, which has now turned into an amazing network and a project, it has continued to play that role. And this afternoon, as I always do when I return to Dayton, my good friend Matt Joseph, and this year I was accompanied by my beloved friend Kathy Lacey. We went to all the pilgrimage points. Now there's a Holbrooke Plaza, which makes me incredibly proud, and a Holbrooke Bridge, and then of course we went to Wright-Patterson, and there I relive, as I do each year, that dramatic first night of the peace talks when my husband seated me between Slobodan Milosevic and Alija Izbegovic, two mortal foes who just the week before had been literally gouging each other's eyes out, or trying to. And Richard said, "Okay, Kati, your job is to make them talk to each other." "Aye, aye, sir," said I. And really for most of that dinner, they were all pretending to ignore each other and looking off in the space in different directions. And at the point of despair at not being able to fulfill my first diplomatic mission, I said just into the air to neither one, I said, "How did this war start anyway?" Like some idiot child. And at that point, they each jumped in and started telling their version. And after a while, they forgot that I was sitting there, and Milosevic said to Izbegovic, "Alija, do you remember the first time we met? It was in Tito's office. You were sitting on a green couch." And Izbegovic said, "Yes, it was Muslim green." And they were off. And I looked at the head table at my husband, and I went, and he went. And so like Dayton, I too played my small part for history. And that was, as I said, the most rewarding chapter of my life. A few weeks after exhausting round-the-clock negotiations, because this was only the opening night, they signed the Dayton Accords, and the peace has held, how many years has it been? 23 years, not a shot fired in anger in Bosnia. Thank you, Dayton. But at what price? 100,000 people were killed on the road to Dayton, and thousands of others have become refugees. But here in Dayton, Richard said, and I quote, that the world's richest nation, one that presumes to great moral authority, cannot make worthy appeals to conscience and merely call on others to carry that burden. I wonder now, do we even call on others to carry a moral burden? I just want you to think about that. And I want to say a few strong words, if you'll allow me, about the present moment, because Richard is no longer able to do so. But I can assure you that he would be on fire at the way the United States is abandoning values. Values. This is not a political speech, I promise you, but those values are the ones that brought me and my family of refugees here. I came here not speaking a word of English, so I feel like I'm in very good company here because we all seem to be from someplace else, and this is what makes America still different from any other countries. I was a small child in the late 50s, and for the 2 years prior to that, I had been separated from my parents. Prior to our escape, my journalist mother and father were called enemies of the people by Hungarian authorities. Tender-aged children brutally separated from their parents, reporters who were called enemies of the people. Does that have a vaguely familiar ring? But that was the Cold War. And my homeland was Soviet-occupied Hungary. But in retaliation to my parents' jailing, the Eisenhower administration cut trade and cultural ties with Hungary for the simple reason that reporters are not enemies of the state, but as essential for a democracy to thrive as oxygen. So when our president declares that the gruesome assassination of a journalist is no reason for us to stop selling weapons to Jamal Khashoggi's alleged assassins, and we know that those alleged assassins are using those weapons in Yemen to the most barbaric effect. We saw the pictures on the front page of the New York Times today. Those are the weapons that we sell them. Well, I think it's time for the least politically engaged to speak up. And we're not discussing politics here, we're discussing values. America in 1995 stood for its original values here in Dayton. It was not our weapons of mass destruction that silenced the guns and stopped the genocide of Muslims in Bosnia. Of course, there was the implicit threat of force, which, by the way, in a typical Richard maneuver, was well represented on that first night that I told you about, because we were seated under giant bombers in the hangar at Wright-Patterson. And that was Richard's way of telling the Balkan chiefs that if diplomacy doesn't work, we have other tools to hand. But it was round-the-clock, painstaking, time-consuming diplomacy that resulted in the Dayton Accords. And that kind of diplomacy is as human an enterprise as the great writing which we celebrate tonight. Dayton shared in a moment when America walked the walk of the values which differentiate us from any other power on earth. We can no longer take those values for granted. Richard, whose diplomatic career began in Vietnam and ended in Afghanistan, knew something about the extremely short distance between hot words and pipe bombs. He had experienced that in war zones. Let's pay attention to the power of the words we speak. Words have power, and we're seeing them in recent days. I have to say, as the grandchild of grandparents who I never knew because they perished in Auschwitz, I never expected to see the terrible thing that unfolded in Pittsburgh yesterday in America. The most meaningful way to honor Richard's memory is for us, all of us, to be on fire now, upholding those endangered values. Thank you so much for everything you do to do that. And thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And finally, my revered friend, John Irving, congratulations on winning the Holbrooke Prize. And over to you, Bob.
Yeah, I think you can if you want. It's up to you. I might tinker with the mood a bit. But before I do, I'd like to add my own expression of gratitude, extreme gratitude, to this year's winners and runners-up, to Min and Michelle and Halala. Now I have to, because of Will's mnemonic on it, it's got to be Halala. And in spirit, I hope Ta-Nehisi Coates, just being a great writer is not quite enough to get you here. There's something different at play in Dayton. There has to be a sensibility there of the highest order, like a ghost or a spirit hovering inside your work and somewhere else inside of you that gives us a glimmer of our own better angels, our poor, battered, much abused better angels. We're here because of this matrix of diplomacy and literature. They both save lives. Michelle and her work with Patrick is a perfect example of a book saving a life. They both open up doors to our hope for a world where we would just leave each other alone. At least let each other be. I don't quite understand that, and then of course I do, because it's about money and land, and hey, you looked at my wife wrong, and anything can happen. But whatever you feel about America today, and it's probably pretty gloomy, you have to believe in this part of it too, this Dayton part of it. You have to believe in tonight, because tonight celebrates a vision that will carry us through. That is Dayton. If you don't believe in this here, I don't think you believe in anything. So, John Irving, I've known him a long time. I'll tell you more about that. Let's see, right now, John Irving graduated from Georgetown Prep in 1983. I've got that wrong. That's Brett Kavanaugh's resume. You know, talk about Grant's memoirs. Grant's memoirs are considered the most a masterpiece of writing, but the greatest piece of deathbed writing ever. He had throat cancer when he wrote those memoirs, and he had a huge thing on his neck. He couldn't swallow food, and after finishing those memoirs, he went to bed and died. And this is pertinent because I think this is the way John Irving would like to have his Lifetime Achievement Award given to him. He writes his next book and dies, and then you can give him the award. He'd be much happier because right now he's a bit cranky about it. He's still working very hard. He still will have another book out. He's still alive. And next May, he's going to receive the National Arts Club Gold Medal in Literature. And people who get this award, John tells me, they die shortly after they receive it. Or they die at the ceremony itself. That makes John very envious, believe me. But I can tell you in all honesty that John is profoundly honored to receive this acknowledgement of his work here in Dayton, and he would be even more thrilled. In fact, he'd probably be euphoric if you could possibly hold the awards ceremony in Paris. All I can say is, John, Dayton's sorry that they couldn't wait for you to die to give you this wonderful award. And everybody here tonight is happy you're with us. Very happy, rather than with Philip Roth and Tom Wolfe and Ursula Le Guin and some others who, all whom died in 2018. This is the better place to be, John. Okay. This is not the first time I've been asked to introduce John Irving, and each time that I've been asked to do it, I think, really? Introduce John? Why? What's the point? Do you introduce Barack Obama or Donald Trump? No, some people, you present them. You don't need to introduce him. He's really too big to introduce. And what would be the point of introducing him? You just don't introduce people like John. You simply say, here he is, because everybody knows who they are, and I mean everybody. So I want to give you some evidence. In 2016, I was on a book tour in France, and every time I got off the train in whatever goddamn city I was, the first face I saw was John's. He was on a billboard in every train station, advertising Avenue of Mysteries. And that was sort of thrilling, but I mean, you think, okay, that's just France, no big deal. Misha? Okay, honey. Misha is my student. Misha, what's going on in India with the Irving thing?
Oh my God, like every time a book comes out, the railway stations and like everywhere there are billboards of him.
Yeah, right. How many books does Irving sell in India?
Millions and millions and millions.
Yeah, I know, it's scary. Okay, hey, Sakina?
Here I am.
Hi, Sakina. When you went to get married in Costa Rica last year or the year before, were there billboards of John Irving on the highways and things?
Well, there were no billboards on the highways, but I can say during our ceremony, a little plane flew back and forth, towing a little banner that says, that advertised John Irving's latest novel.
Yeah, right. How many books does Irving sell in Central and South America?
I don't know.
Yeah, I think there's too many to count. So, I mean, come on. You don't need to interview John Irving. Everybody in the world knows him. So I thought I'd just talk a little bit about myself. No, I forgot. This word patriarchy, probably when John and I stand together and you see our white hair and our white skin, you think, there it is, the patriarchy. But Sakina and Misha, stand up again, because I want to talk about the new patriarchy. So, these are some of the most talented women I have ever taught. They are amazing. And they will be stars one day. But, so Kurt Vonnegut was John Irving's mentor. John Irving was my mentor. I was their mentor. Now they have literary DNA of John Irving and Kurt Vonnegut in them. That's who they are. To me, that's the new patriarchy. There's the girls. Thanks, ladies. Okay, about me then. In 1968, I was 17 years old. John Irving was 26. John Irving had just published his first novel called Setting Free the Bears. I walked into People's Drugstore in McLean, Virginia, where I grew up, and I went right to the paperback rack because I wanted to read something, and it was a vertical rack, and it twirled around, and I twirled it around, and it stopped at this book called Paperback Setting Free the Bears. I picked it up, I took it home, I read it, I was bewitched. I didn't bother to remember the author's name. I went away to college. There were 2 more books that sort of entranced me, and I looked at them, and it was by the guy who wrote Setting Free the Bears, 158-Pound Marriage, and The Water Method Man. Then I went into the Peace Corps, went away, came back, applied to all the MFA writing programs in America, and got rejected by all of them, Min and Michelle. And I went and got a master's degree in American literature at the University of Missouri in 1978, 77, 78, 79. A book came out that crushed me. It had everything to do with me becoming a writer, and it was called The World According to Garp. And it taught me about things about structure, about integrating ancient wisdom into a contemporary story. It taught me a lot about taking risks. It was just a mind blower, and it had the same effect on American culture. And I was just stunned by it. And I kept applying to writing schools, and I did get into Iowa. One of my teachers at Iowa happened to be a character in 158-Pound Marriage. It was John's best friend, a guy named Don Hendry Jr. And Don wasn't going to live too many more years, but before, I graduated from Iowa. I didn't know, but Hendry had told John, who I'd never met, never imagined meeting, had told John to take care of me. I didn't know that. And I was at Breadloaf as an unpublished book writer. I had no books. I was just there as a scholar in Breadloaf in 1983. And I was standing at the bank of mailboxes, and this guy came up to me and tapped me on the shoulder. He said, "Are you Psicosis?" And I turned, and it's like, oh God. Because John Irving was now a superstar in American culture. He had full-page ads of him in New Yorker magazine, dressed in your wrestling gear, and it was wild. And I couldn't believe it. And he said, "Henry, told me to look for you. Let's go out on the porch and talk." I was astounded. I had published a magazine story. I just couldn't believe what was happening to me. We sat down and talked, and we said blah, blah, blah. And I said, I just saw Hendry in Tuscaloosa. He was running the writing program at University of Alabama. And there was a party, and I was at the party having a really nice conversation with this guy. And Hendry came up and pulled me away. And I said, "What's going on?" Hendry said, "That's a critic. Don't talk to him." And on the porch, Hendry said, "Yeah, that's right. Hendry's right. Don't talk to them." He get this very Trumpian voice. Critics are your enemy. And before I could respond, John jumped up. There's a road that goes right through the center of Breadloaf. And a car was going through it. The speed limit was probably about 15 miles an hour, and a car was going through it at about 20 miles an hour. And John jumped up and ran and caught the car, like a dog catching the car, and demanded that they slow down. And this is a scene in Garp. All of a sudden, I don't know what reality is. Ever since meeting John Irving, I'm not sure what reality is. But that was just astonishing to me. So started the writing program at Bennington, which was near where John lived on the mountain up above Bennington and Dorset. And we'd have dinner twice a year forever. And I got to see your third child born and starting to grow up and everything, and be part of a family and call up on Super Bowl Sunday, who do you want to win? It was just so bewitching and generous, and that's the message I want to leave with you about who John Irving is. It's not just me. He did things for me and a whole range of young writers that I never knew about until somebody else told me about it. And from talking to other young writers, I know he had done the same for them. It didn't matter who. He was there. It was like really having a big brother in a place where you never really expected to have anybody really truly helping you out, because that's what they really believed in. They help you out because maybe they could make some money or something. That's what other people were doing. But when John helped you out, it was like the best gift. It was a miracle. So John, it's the 40th anniversary of The World According to Garp. And John emailed me the other day. He said, that 40-year-old novel begins with a sexual assault in a movie theater where, guess what, no one believes the woman who was assaulted. That sounds a little too fucking familiar to be believed. And this fall marks the 40th anniversary of Garp, which I imagined when I was writing it would be out of date before I could finish the manuscript. Who knew that sexual hatred wasn't going away? Who knew that sexual intolerance would still be tolerated? But it is. So, John, inspired by those magnificent lions that guard the entrance to the New York Public Library in Manhattan, the accolade literary lion would, by the middle of the 20th century, be bestowed upon America's greatest living writers, and by the end of that century and the beginning of this one, perhaps no member of that distinguished pride roared as mightily across the planet as the voice of novelist John Irving, the indefatigable author of 14 novels, soon to be 15, and I bet he'll even get to 16. And 10 of those have been international bestsellers. He has sold millions of copies in America. He's sold more books overseas, which to me is incredible. Just to be around somebody like, whoa, you the man. The 76-year-old Irving has been widely celebrated both here and abroad as a master storyteller and comic genius, anchored deep within layer upon layer of gravitas, praised equally for his intrepid and fearless engagement with controversial subject matter, and for the depth of his empathetic humanity, both as an artist and as a person. Irving's narcotically addictive fictions have made him a household name in dozens of nations. And it's earned him the rare status of an acclaimed literary writer who has simultaneously achieved stratospheric popular commercial success. And it can be said with some certainty that John Irving is the only literary lion in history to be both inducted into the Wrestling Hall of Fame. And by the way, he was wrestling today after that panel with Mark Harmon. And they said, come on, Mark, beat his ass, he's an old man. But I think John got the better of him. Both the Wrestling Hall of Fame and presented with an Oscar. This is the wrap-up, John. If I can get the page. John Irving wants to be known as a world-class entertainer, and he is. And he also wouldn't mind if we think of him as our time's or our generation's version of Charles Dickens, and we do. But what makes Irving such a beloved author around the world is that against the violence he finds sweeping down on us, he provides the counterweight of a gentle affection between people, and let's not forget, animals. Merciful and sincere and indeed heartbreaking in its frequent futility. And against desperation, we find in Irving, always when we least expect it, a hand extended against bigotry and hatred. When all the accounting is done, he'll be remembered as one of the most generous writers representing us in the world and in the future. I know over these decades, John's pissed off a few people. Too bad. I know that not everybody loves John or loves his work, but I also know that millions and millions of people do. That's astonishing. That's a big of a mystery to me as how do you get planes to fly? There's something there that is stratospheric and transcendent, and I'm in awe, and I always will be in love with John Irving.
Never write Bob an email when you're working on a speech. He'll steal half of it. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Kati. And thank you, Richard Holbrooke. I'm grateful when anyone notices that my fiction has a social conscience. I'm more used to hearing that I repeat myself. It's no coincidence that sexual intolerance and sexual violence repeat themselves too. I'm speaking to you as an American who lives in Canada. More than 3 years ago, I went through the immigration process in Toronto. In various waiting rooms, I was occasionally the only adult applicant for permanent residence who spoke English. I helped the other applicants fill out their immigration forms. A few times, I saw those families who were granted protected person status by the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada. I worked with the children. They understood English better than their parents. I remember a girl, she was 12 or 13. She was actually worried about my immigration story. "What about you, mister?" she asked me. "What are you running away from?" Last month, as the number of refugees from war and other human rights violations continued to rise, the Trump administration capped refugee admissions at the lowest level since 1980. I'm remembering that girl and her family who were running for their lives. All I did was marry my Canadian editor of the Cider House Rules. She later became my literary agent. We were living in the US and in Canada, but we got tired of going back and forth. Now we live in Toronto full-time. We were never running for our lives. Yet this young girl, who had endured a dangerous and fearful life, was worried about me. I got my sexual politics and my social conscience from my mother. She taught me to see and sympathize with sexual minorities, beginning with the understanding that women were treated as if they were sexual minorities. From their example, I could see that more vulnerable groups, gay men, lesbian women, transgender men and women, were treated worse. The World According to Garp is a sexual assassination story. Garp's mother is killed by a man who hates women. Her son is killed by a woman who hates men. When I was beginning Garp in the early 70s, I thought that sexual violence, what I was writing about, would soon be extinct. In 1978, when Garp was published, I thought I'd written a period piece. I was wrong. As I wrote to Bob, sexual hatred hasn't gone away. We should be ashamed that sexual intolerance is still tolerated, but it is. The World According to Garp is a feminist novel. Yet, in the passage of time, I've become more of a feminist. Why? Because the discrimination women faced in the startup days of the women's movement hasn't gone away. The anti-abortion crusaders are still here. Women are still treated as if they were sexual minorities. Even today, 60% of women who've been sexually assaulted never report their abuse. You can understand why they don't. We've seen repeatedly and just recently how women who are brave enough to come forward are not believed. They are even ridiculed by the President of the United States. It's no coincidence that the World According to Garp begins with a sexual assault. Garp's mother is assaulted in a movie theater. As I wrote to Bob, no one believes she was assaulted, not even her own family. Roberta, the transgender woman who used to be a tight end for the Philadelphia Eagles, is a hero in Garp, and for 40 years, a personal hero of mine. I'm still writing about Roberta. Miss Frost, the transgender librarian in One Person, came from Roberta. Flor, the transgender prostitute in Avenue of Mysteries, came from Roberta and Miss Frost. President Obama recognized transgender rights. In May 2016, the Department of Education instructed schools to accept students' gender identity, which was not defined by the sex listed on their birth certificates or by their genitalia. This allowed students to use the bathrooms of their choice. President Trump's education secretary, Betsy DeVos, revoked these compassionate guidelines soon after she was confirmed. In October of last year, President Trump's Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, ruled that transgender people were not protected from workplace discrimination. President Trump and the Department of Justice are opposed to transgender rights. I know what Roberta would say. Just last week, the New York Times reported that the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services is attempting to establish a legal definition of sex. How convenient. They want to define gender as an immutable condition determined at birth, thus rolling back the clock on the recognition and protection of transgender men and women. The Trump administration is considering no less than defining transgender out of existence. If this happens in the US, I know what will happen in Canada. American transgender men and women will seek protected person status as human rights refugees, like the families whose immigration forms I helped to fill out. But those refugees were from places like Syria and Afghanistan, you know, places that have long been accused of human rights abuses. These are sexually abusive times in the United States. The world, according to Garp, should be out of date. Garp was written in a divided time, but this country is more divided today than it was 40 years ago. The World According to Garp is a protest novel. I would write a few more. The Cider House Rules was published in 1985, more than a decade after the Roe v. Wade the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court decision that gave women the right to an abortion. Cider House is an historical novel, but it's also an abortion novel. The Roe v. Wade decision isn't safe. Does the U.S. Supreme Court look safe to you? The best first sentence to a novel I've written is the first sentence in Last Night and in Twisted River. The young Canadian, who could not have been more than 15, had hesitated too long. My longest first sentence is in A Prayer for Owen Meany. I am doomed to remember a boy with a wrecked voice, not because of his voice, or because he was the smallest person I ever knew, or even because he was the instrument of my mother's death, but because he is the reason I believe in God. That's not all the first sentence, but that's enough. I'll stop there. I don't believe in God. In part, I wrote the novel to create the kind of miracle that would make a believer out of me, if I'd ever known anyone like Owen Meany. I didn't. More accurately, I thought I didn't. One Christmas in the early 1980s, I went home to New Hampshire. I spent the better part of one night with some childhood friends. I hadn't seen them in years. We spent our time remembering friends who were killed in Vietnam or who returned from the war so badly damaged that they would never recover from it. In addition to these casualties, we included those friends whose lives were forever changed, in some cases ruined, because of the extreme measures they took not to go to Vietnam. Suddenly, one of my friends mentioned a name that drew a blank with me. Either I never knew him or I didn't remember him. Then another of my friends reminded me that in Sunday school, we used to lift up this little boy. He was our age, about 8 or 9, but he was so tiny we could pass him back and forth over our heads. It enraged him, which was why we did it. It might even have been my idea. At least it was the opinion of my friends that I was the first one who picked him up. I remembered him instantly. He and his family moved away long before we were teenagers. I had no further contact with him, but someone heard he'd been killed in Vietnam. I was amazed. I said one of the stupidest things I've ever said. But he was too small to go to Vietnam. My friends looked at me with pity and concern. "Johnny," one of them said, "maybe he grew." That night I lay awake in bed wondering, what if he didn't grow? That was when I knew Owen Meany was a Vietnam novel, another protest novel. The politics in my novels aren't always sexual, but my interest in being political began with sexual politics. I keep saying this. I've been saying this for too long. Of my 14 novels, by my count, 6 or 7 are what I would call political, or they have what my mom called a social conscience. The 15th, the one I'm writing now, is another one. It suffices to say that half my novels are protesting something. Don't get me wrong, as I said earlier today, I don't think protest is a requirement for a novel. I'm just comfortable with protesting when I see a place for it. When I was writing Garb and Cider House and Owen Meany and 4 or 5 other novels, I could see the appropriate places. I just never imagined there would be so many places. Thank you.
One more congratulations to all of the writers who have been honored tonight. Sharon Rabb, you are a source of wonder. I have been in Dayton a lot the past 3 weeks, and you never stop going, morning, noon, and night. A ferocious activism on your part. You talked about each and every one of these writers in this room with such glory in your voice. It even got me choked up a few times listening to you. I wish you were on the ballot. We all thank you deeply. I leave you with a 4-letter word: vote. 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 And now, ladies and gentlemen, here to close this wonderful evening under the direction of Jeremy Winston, the Central State University Chorus. They will be singing Steady Soldier, arranged by Dieter Robinson, and Let There Be Peace on Earth, arranged by Levant Hurd, Shaniqua Nixon, and Jeremy Winston.
Steady soldier, steady soldier, steady. Lord, I'll be a steady soldier, steady soldier, steady. Lord, till I die. Steady.